Welcome to a study of the parables of Jesus. This is lesson number 22. Today we will study two parables for several reasons, one of which is that Luke puts them one after the other in chapter 18 of his gospel. They're the parable of the widow and the judge. You probably know the parable of the widow and the judge more from the King James title, The Persistent Widow. But we miss out on that word persistent. It means persistent there means almost what nagging does today. So she was a widow and a judge. And that's immediately followed by the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So I'll give you a moment to turn to chapter 18 in Luke's Gospel, and we will read the first parable. The NIV even says the parable of the persistent widow. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. Now, that's one of the reasons we can take these two parables in one lesson. Jesus tells us through telling his apostles or disciples what the parable is about. There's the lesson already. We wouldn't even have to read the parable to get it. It says, pray in all circumstances. Paul must have read this over and over again before he advised his followers, pray without ceasing. There is no occasion in life, no situation that we face, whether it's one of joy or sorrow, conflict or peace, that will not be enriched by praying. Never quit praying. No matter how despondent or melancholy you are, keep on praying. In a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. I'm afraid we have judges on the bench today that follow in his footsteps, sad to say. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. Now, incidentally, and in detail, this is not only a parable about keeping on praying, it is keeping on praying for something, single idea, justice. God's justice is always right, and we need to pray that it prevail. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care about men, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually wear me out with her coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. Will not God bring about justice for all of his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? The parable of the widow and the judge. Let's look at the background of this parable. The literary setting, Luke tells us that Jesus spoke this parable to show the need for always praying and never giving up to despair. That's my translation. The Palestinian background of the parable is important for our understanding of its meaning, because it is in that culture, a widow had no one to defend her rights except the judges and God. In fact, if you go back into the Old Testament, you'll see that God charged judges under the law to see that widows got justice because they didn't have anybody but God and the law on their side. With that exception, the Palestinian background is irrelevant. The story would fit almost any culture and almost any historical setting since the rise of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Until agriculture put people in stable villages and towns, people went around in small groups. They knew what was going on. They didn't even need judges. They just had a few elders of the tribe, and they would see that justice was done. But since the rise of agriculture, and now industrial, and now technological society, we certainly need good judges. The meaning of the parable as a whole and the meaning of the individual elements are the same. Two themes are emphasized: to keep on praying and never give up in despair. And God will never be long in seeking justice for his covenant people in history. This is the theme of the whole book of Revelation. The idea that God does this in history, my fellow believers. We don't have to wait until the final judgment. That final judgment will be final, and true justice will be achieved. But God reserves the right to intervene in the course of history to bring justice. If you feel that you're not getting justice, pray to God. Don't seek vengeance. Don't seek to use underhanded means, gossip or rumor or slander. Pray to God, and he will get you justice. Making this parable your own. How persistent are you praying for the things that are important to you? That's a good question. I've had people tell me, well, I've prayed and prayed, and it didn't happen. And I asked them, how? Prayed and prayed? How many times? How often? This woman kept on persistently. If it is important to you, keep praying until you get an answer, even if that answer is no. But don't quit praying. Well, you say, that seems kind of futile. No, that's the whole point. You're praying not to a judge that doesn't care for God or man. You're praying to a heavenly Father who is eager. Remember the parable of the prodigal son? A father who will run out to meet you more than halfway. So keep on praying. Never give up. I'm reminded of the famous graduation address that Winston Churchill spoke. It was to a small college in the Midwest United States. Can't remember which one. And they introduced him and all of them. He got up, had that bulldog look. He put his hands on his hips and stuck that chin out, and he says, never, 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 never give up. Thank you, and sat down. Jesus would have understood and appreciated that. So, between Jesus and Winston Churchill, my fellow believers, keep praying. Before you studied this parable, how aware were you that giving into despair, especially when praying to God to grant you justice, was a sin? Most people think that despair is just a natural consequence. For Christians, despair is a sin. Depression, melancholy, that's not a sin. Despair is when you say, there is no hope. And Paul tells us, my fellow believers, we are saved by hope. So don't give up. Make a list now, thirdly, of the things that you have quit praying for that are important to you, and begin to pray for them consistently until God grants them, or they're no longer important to you, or you get a definite answer, not now, my child. Now let's turn to the second parable, just in the next verse. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. That's chapter 18, beginning in verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. That is a really important phrase there. We ought to pray, first of all, about others. We ought to pray about God's will being done. But this Pharisee was so full of himself that even when he talked to God, the subject was himself. God, I thank you that I am not like all other men. You know what? I'm going to interpolate something here because we're in the middle of a political campaign. This Pharisee reminds me of a lot of the candidates. They tell us how much different they are than all other men or women, and expect us to be motivated to vote for them. A person full of himself. I'm going to put it another way I've heard. A man wrapped up in himself makes a mighty small package. I'm not like other men. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. Notice, not only was he full of himself, he was hypercritical of others. He didn't know what those other people were. He was a cynic. The idea was, if you're not like me, you're a sinner. I fast twice a week. The Jews usually fasted either Tuesdays or Thursdays, but he wanted people to know he fasted on both Tuesday and Thursday and give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He didn't get up in front of everybody else. He was so self-effacing. He went off to the side at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat on his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. The literary setting of this parable is given by Luke in the words, he told them this parable to those who were confident of their goodness, made them better than other people, and felt superior to everyone else. My translation. The Palestinian background. It may surprise you that all praying and reading in the first century was spoken out loud. They didn't. One of the things that surprised me when I learned about it, and I must have been 35 years old, that there was no such thing as silent reading or silent praying until the Middle Ages. Everything was out loud. If you want to see what that's like, go to an Orthodox Jewish service, and everybody is praying the same prayer, liturgical prayer, but they're all doing it out loud at their own speed. And then you might understand why Paul was so insistent to the Corinthians that things be done decently and in order. This is still true in many parts of the world. The Jews who lived in Jerusalem went to the temple courtyard to pray 3 times a day. They went at 9 in the morning, at noon, and at 3 in the afternoon. The meaning of this parable as a whole: the person who prays with a sense of moral superiority to others will not receive forgiveness for their sins, while the person who simply acknowledges their sins to God with no sense of moral superiority will receive forgiveness. Let's look at the meaning of the individual elements of this prayer. The Pharisee represents the person who prays to God with a sense of moral superiority over others. The tax collector represents those who approach God in prayer with a sense of how far they are from meeting God's expectations of them, and confesses this to Him and receives forgiveness. You want to make this parable your own. Examine yourself carefully. Are you conscious of feeling morally superior to other people in your family, your church, your workplace, or in the general population? You must be scrupulously honest here. And it may not be very easy or very satisfactory what you discover. But remember, God stands ready to remove all sin from your life. If you do feel morally superior to others, what are you going to do about it? Thank you, and have a good day.